Imagine stumbling upon 62 handwritten volumes of a dictator's most private thoughts. I mean, a discovery that could literally rewrite history. Well, in 1983, one of the world's biggest magazines thought they'd hit that exact jackpot. They were about to learn a very, very expensive and very public lesson in how to get played. So let's dive into how this spectacular forgery actually happened.
For just a little while, these diaries were the absolute holy grail of the publishing world. The German magazine Stern was convinced they had the personal journals of Adolf Hitler, somehow smuggled out of East Germany. And this wasn't just some minor story. It was supposed to be a first-hand account of everything: his rise to power, his private motivations, his darkest secrets. It was the scoop of a lifetime, promising a direct window into the mind of a monster.
And you will not believe what they paid for it. The final price tag was 9.3 million Deutschmarks. Now that was about $4 million US back then, which today would be over $12 million. An absolutely staggering sum of money, all handed over in briefcases full of cash for a secret that was supposed to change the world.
Yeah, you heard that right. Every single page was a lie. This wasn't just some small mistake. It was one of the most audacious, most embarrassing scams in modern history. So the question is, how did a low-level grifter pull this whole thing off?
Well, every great con has two key players. You've got the artist who creates the lie, and you've got the mark who's just desperate to believe it. And this story? Man, it's a textbook example of that classic setup.
So on one side, you have Konrad Kujau, a really talented mimic and petty criminal who ran a memorabilia shop. And on the other, you have Gerd Heidemann, a star reporter for Stern magazine who is drowning in debt and totally obsessed with the Third Reich. See where this is going? Kujau needed a buyer, and Heidemann desperately needed a miracle. It was the definition of a perfect storm.
So why was a huge, powerful magazine the perfect mark? It all comes down to this right here: confirmation bias. The editors at Stern wanted these diaries to be real so badly. Think about it. The fame, the money, the historical impact, that incredible desire completely blinded them to all the red flags, and Kujau played on that perfectly.
Now here's where it gets really fascinating. Let's look at how the forgery was actually built. Kujau was a master of appearances. He understood that making something feel like history was just as important as the words on the page.
First off, he needed a believable story. So he invented this incredible backstory, and he rooted it in a real event, a 1945 plane crash near a town called Bernersdorf. He claimed the diaries were on that plane, found by villagers, and then smuggled out of communist East Germany by his brother, who was supposedly a high-ranking general. It was this thrilling Cold War spy story that perfectly explained all the secrecy and, of course, the insane price.
So, to create the actual diaries, Kujau went out and bought cheap, modern notebooks from a department store. Then he got to work. He brewed really strong black tea and used it to stain the pages, giving them that 40-year-old yellowed look. He'd even batter the covers, hit them with a hammer, to make them seem like they'd survived a plane crash and decades hidden in a hayloft.
But here's an almost comical mistake. Kujau attached these plastic Gothic initials to the covers, but instead of using an A for Adolf, he used an F. When they asked him about it, he just made something up on the spot, saying it stood for Führer. And in all their excitement, the magazine's leadership just went with it. They accepted it.
You know, Kujau's real masterstroke was the sheer scale of the lie. Even this eminent historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, was completely fooled. His argument was that the quantity itself was proof they were real. His logic? Who on earth would bother to forge 60 volumes? It was a disastrous but powerful failure of expertise.
Okay, now we get to the climax. The world's media is all gathered. Sterner is ready to unveil its prize. This was supposed to be their moment of triumph. Instead, it became their greatest humiliation.
Just picture the scene. Hamburg, Germany. Hundreds of reporters are packed into this room. Cameras are flashing everywhere. The editors of Stern are up on stage, ready to present the scoop of the century to a very skeptical world. The tension is absolutely sky high.
And then, suddenly, the whole event just descends into chaos. A controversial historian named David Irving, who actually knew about Kujau's other forgeries, gate crashes the press conference. He stands up and starts shouting that the diaries are fakes, calling them rubbish for everyone to hear. The carefully managed presentation just shatters in an instant.
So now they're getting hit with a barrage of questions from reporters. And the experts on stage, including Trevor Roper, they start to visibly crumble. They admit, well, maybe the chain of evidence isn't quite as strong as we thought. Live, on global television, the entire story collapses into this humiliating public spectacle.
So while all the historians were arguing over handwriting and tone, another investigation was happening in the background, one that didn't care about a good story. Science was about to walk in and deliver the final, undeniable knockout punch.
See, the historians were looking at things like handwriting, content, subjective stuff you could argue about all day. But the forensic scientists at the West German Federal Archives, they were looking at the physical objects, the paper, the ink, the glue. And what they found, well, there was just no arguing with it.
The science revealed these fatal flaws, anachronisms that prove the diaries were totally modern fakes. First, the paper contained an optical brightener, a chemical whitener that wasn't even used in paper until 1954. Second, the bindings were held together with polyester threads, a synthetic fiber that didn't exist until after World War II. And finally, chemical analysis showed the ink was only a few months old, not decades. The diaries were physically impossible. Game over.
On May 6, 1983, the official report came out, and the conclusion was brutal and direct. The diaries weren't just forgeries, they were grotesque and crude. The science was in, the debate was over, and now it was time for the fallout.
You'd think a story this embarrassing would end with everyone involved just fading away into obscurity, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The aftermath of this whole thing was just as bizarre as the crime itself.
The key players did face justice. Both the forger, Konrad Kujau, and the reporter, Gerhard Heidemann, were sentenced to over 4 years in prison. Heidemann was convicted for basically stealing millions of the magazine's money, while Kujau, of course, went down for the fraud.
But here is the wild twist. After he gets out of prison, Kujau becomes this minor celebrity, kind of an anti-establishment folk hero. He opened up a gallery and made a living selling genuine Kujau forgeries, so copies of famous paintings, but signed with his own name. The con man literally became the main attraction. And what about all that money? Of the 9.3 million marks, some of it went to Kujau, millions were embezzled by Heidemann, and a huge chunk of it just vanished. Poof. To this day, it has never been fully accounted for. The financial mystery was just as deep as the historical one.
This whole insane scandal leaves us with a really important question, especially for our own time. Kujau sold a story that people wanted to hear, and he became famous for it. It really makes you wonder. In an age of constant misinformation, when a lie is compelling and the truth is kind of complicated, which one are we more likely to believe?